Hello everybody, and welcome back to Mission MCU Podcast, where we discuss everything in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I am your host, Ryan Simmers, and joining me today is my co-host, Ashley Strunk. And today we will be discussing Captain America, the First Avenger. It was directed by Joe Johnston, screenwriters Christopher Marcus and Steve McFeely, produced by Kevin Feige, starring Chris Evans as Captain America, Haley Atwell as Peggy Carter, Hugo Weaving as Johann Schmidt Red Skull, Tommy Lee Jones as Colonel Chester Phillips, Sebastian Stan as James Bucky Barnes, and Stanley Tucci as Dr. Abraham Erskine. It was released in 2011 and preceded by Thor and followed up by The Avengers. So Ashley, your first movie in the MCU timeline, what are your first thoughts? I'm very excited to hear.
All right, my first full movie, never watched one before. I think the opening scene was definitely really confusing, not having any background. Like, I had no idea what I was walking into. I think, and I just kept telling myself, like, you just have to keep watching, everything's gonna come together. I think one of the big things that stuck out to me was the love story. Being a female, it was something that really drew me in, because I was like, okay, is this gonna happen? Is this not gonna happen? Like, where are we going with it? But also just a lot of the character development. I like him being like this scrawny little guy who, you know, was bullied and beat up in the alley. Like, you kind of feel for him, and all he wants to do is serve in the military. And so that was, like, relatable for a lot of people, I'm assuming, just because not everybody can do everything. And he just had this one goal of, like, I want to do more. And then seeing the progression throughout the film was really cool to watch, and definitely not what I expected.
Excellent. No, Ashley, you hit a couple of very important points there. As far as the first scene goes, I will get to that when we go over things that we didn't like about the movie, because I also agree that is very confusing, to me at least, and there are things I'll discuss with that. But as Steve Rogers / Captain America, no, I felt the movie was very well in setting up. They did a very good job of setting you up to love the character of Steve Rogers before he becomes Captain America. So right. You like his character, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. So you see him as this person that he has this fear of missing out, so to speak. You know, he wants to be more, although just physically he can't. And just like a small detail, like when he's going through that line to try to get enlisted in the army, they straight up say there's a multitude of things that disqualify you. But
right, you like see his thing on the list, like his whole list of like abilities that he doesn't have. You know, he has asthma, he has all these things that are wrong with him, they say.
Right, and that's the thing. That's the one thing that the guy mentions was the asthma alone, you're not allowed in. Right. You know, and doesn't even go into the other ones, right? So it's like without him even being able to help, you know, to do anything himself, he's already cast aside, you know. So it's a thing where, like you said, you feel for him. You fall in love with his character and who he is as Steve Rogers before he even gets the serum. So I think that's a very good attribute of the movie, because then everything after that is just amplified, right? His character, now that he has the muscles and he has the physique and the super strength that comes with administering the serum.
Right. Everything started as like this little guy.
Exactly.
Like he's still in there.
Right. Exactly. Even though he's this big guy now, he is still Steve Rogers inside. That's a key talking point too, that the serum does not change him. And I can segue into our antagonist of Johann Schmidt Red Skull, where he also got the serum, right? So in a flashback, Dr. Erskine talks about that, and you know that he was very adamant of getting the serum, and the doctor even says like it wasn't ready yet, and that the serum amplifies within, and that's the whole premise of why he chose Steve Rogers and sought him out to be this test subject for his, and was so confident of the potential success of this serum in Steve Rogers, because it amplifies the person within, not who they are on the outside. So you can see the ramifications of the serum on Red Skull, and then you can see the ramifications of Steve Rogers and how they completely contrast each other. That basically transforms them into, it expresses their protagonist versus antagonist dynamic within the film.
Right. Okay, so I guess that's another part that was like kind of confusing for me, is like knowing that like it amplifies the personality or like how they're feeling. So like that makes more sense looking back, that like how evil Johann was.
Right. Yeah, so that was a thing too. It was actually interesting because he is the leader of this group called Hydra. It was Hitler. He was appointed by Hitler in World War II in this story. That he was part of the research division for Hitler's military, and Red Skull kind of goes off on his own. He feels that Hitler's directive and his motives are just not up to speed on what Red Skull feels they should be. So he kind of secretly diverts and starts headwaying his own Hydra, taking it under his wing as his own, and then taking that off. So then as he just has this mentality, he still has that mentality of like conquering and world domination type aspects.
Right.
And that's brought through it's magnified by the serum.
Okay, so Hydra is like the army that they formed.
Right. It's basically, it was formed by Red Skull, Johann Schmidt, but it's an extension of Hitler's regime. Yes, Red Skull was appointed by Hitler as his research scientist and head of that research division.
Okay, so it's like the research department of
the Nazis.
The Nazis.
Exactly.
I think that was confusing because they kept mentioning Hydra, but nobody ever actually says what it is.
Right. Yeah. So
and you're like, is it an energy company? Like that was where my head was.
a little bit larger scale than that, but no, no, you're right. Yes, it's Hitler's research division that ends up diverting from his kind of mentality and regime, so it becomes its own entity. And
because he wants to take power, because Johann wants to take over the world. Basically,
yes. So a dynamic that's displayed right off the bat in the second scene. So not the ice scene, but obviously when Red Skull is introduced into the movie, the scene where he comes and gets the cube.
Yes.
The Tesseract.
Yeah. Also, really confusing because there was no background.
Right. So in that scene itself, there are pretty much I count about 3 good talking points with that. So Red Skull mentions, the cube that he acquires is called the Tesseract, and you will learn more in upcoming films about that. So it's understandable that's kind of like a question mark right now.
It's what's this shiny cube?
Right. In a world of World War II, back in the 1940s, there's this cube of power, right? What is surrounding this? What does all of this involve? So you're introduced to the Tesseract right off the bat. Red Skull mentions Odin when he gets the cube, so it kind of dives into, he has knowledge of Norse mythology, Thor, Odin, things like that, Asgard, stuff like that.
I got nothing about that.
Ashley's shaking her head right now.
I got nothing.
we will very well dive into that. So, but that's the first mention of Thor's father, Odin. So then we can kind of relate this already to a mythological power, something that is otherworldly. And so that kind of relates to Red Skull, that he's not just seeking this worldly power to try to dominate the world in this aspect. He's seeking otherworldly means to enact his motives. But then in addition to that, like I said, it does set up the point for the Tesseract, which we will carry through actually the first phase of Marvel all the way up to the Avengers film.
Okay, so this keeps coming back.
This keeps coming back. Yeah, this is going to be something
cube.
That's right, because at the end, how at the end
they find it.
Yes. So it is in their possession now. They do have it, right? So this is something that's going to be a recurring factor. And then also one other thing I want to note from that first sequence is I love how when Red Skull shoots the guy that's guarding the cube, right, and blood splatters everywhere, they do a close-up of that Hydra symbol on his jacket.
Okay.
That it was scattered.
I knew that something was important about it, but I couldn't figure out.
Right, and that's just another
the symbolism.
Right, and that is just another minute detail of how I feel the production team did a very good job of kind of alluding to. Well, Hydra is this organization that will shed blood by any means to get what they want, but then also it kind of preludes Red Skull's reveal later in the film, because when you see him there, he's in his normal skin, right? He's got this mask on and everything.
Yeah,
you don't see for what he really is.
The foreshadowing in earlier in the film where the guy's doing the painting and they're talking to the professor, whoever, the scientist, but they never show his face. So I knew that something was happening, but I didn't understand. I knew that there was some kind of face happening, but you don't really know what.
Right. And another scene that I really loved from that was when the Dr. Zola is his name, basically his right-hand man, he comes in and it's the scene where he's getting painted. right?
Yeah.
It's the painting scene. So he's shadowed up. You don't really see.
You never see his face.
You never see his face. Exactly. So,
but you know something's going on.
Well, you do. Yeah. And then you see the red paint like off to the side, but it never reveals anything. So that was another foreshadowing type aspect used by the production team for the big reveal. So I loved those little minute details. Watching it again, I know what's coming, but seeing it this time, I didn't pick those things out. Well, I picked out the painting scene, but I didn't pick out the insignia on his jacket with the blood. So it was like, oh my gosh, like that is such an interesting detail that your first watch you could sometimes overlook, but I'm glad you caught that.
Yeah.
So I do want to return to Steve and Captain America real quick. But setting aside like the plot line or anything, that character as the protagonist, how did you feel about his development going through the story, the movie?
I mean, the development, everything about it was great. Like, you start off with this little guy who just wants to be a part of something, but he never loses, like, his truth to himself. Like, he is fully himself from the beginning to the end. And I feel like that was, like, a huge plus on all scales.
Yes. I completely agree. I very much agree. Something that I definitely noted that I didn't notice the first couple times watching this through, it's a very big testament to Steve's character that's promoted that when he's in the theater, he hasn't transformed into Captain America yet. He's in the theater and it's portrayed in that like commercial before the movie, like, well, if you're not in the war, you can still make an impact. And they show that little clip of the kid like collecting scrap metal and stuff like that. So it's becoming this outlet and reaching out to Steve that it's like, oh, even though you're who you are, you can still make an impact. Maybe not the impact that you want to, but you can still be an impact. But deep down, Steve's like, no, like I can do more. Like this isn't...
He always like needed to be in the military.
Right. He's not going to settle. He'll never settle. And he always wants to go above and beyond. And after that, he actually mentions collecting scrap metal to Bucky later on in the film. So I love how they followed up with that as well. Leading into Bucky, I'll just make a short note. I'm curious to how you felt about Bucky, because there's something I do want to say about this later on. But I like the dynamic they try to set up with Bucky and Steve, that he saves him from that bullying, that guy beating him up in the alley, right? That Bucky is introduced as this lifelong friend. They allude to like knowing each other for years. And Bucky comes and saves him from that guy beating him up, and that he's more of like this kind of like borderline like father figure to him as far as like leading him through things that, when Steve feels down on himself a little bit, Bucky's always there to kind of lift him up.
Right. I mean, I think they had a really great, like, dynamic of a friendship, and I feel like coming back, then Bucky's saving him in the beginning, but then in the end, he's saving Bucky.
Very good point. Very good point. And that's something I actually didn't write down. So, no, that is a very good talking point, that the roles were switched now, that when Steve got his chance.
And he made it his mission. He was like going to find his friend.
Right, exactly.
Like against all odds.
Right. So no, very good point that the roles were now switched. Bucky has been saving him all his life from people who are bullying him. Now, how Steve views the Nazis and the German forces as the bullies, he's saving Bucky from them. No, very good talking point. Very good point. Another thing I do want to mention in regards to Steve's character, I do want to go back to that just for a second. Something I had noticed is that even when he does become Captain America, he still thinks he's not enough. Because there's a line when Erskine got shot, right? Dr. Erskine shot, he's dead.
Right.
And then Peggy's talking to him after, and Peggy's like, Dr. Erskine would be so happy with, what you've become, and everything. He'd be very proud of this result.
Yeah.
Steve says Erskine deserved more than that. He deserved more than this. So he's saying he deserved, because their plan was originally to not only make one person, but if it succeeded, to make multiple super soldiers, right? So even when Peggy says like he would be so happy with the results, Steve even says, I don't think this is enough. I'm still not enough. He still has that complex that he's not enough, and he still feels it could be more. But
do you think that's like alluding to just like the fact that like Erskine died, and like he just felt that as a doctor, he deserved more, not just because he wanted more, but because he was such a good person.
Well, yes.
I think he was attempting to be.
I think that's a point that the producers, they pose that question as you can look at it both ways. Like, did he deserve more than that, just giving Steve the power? Or is Steve still thinks he deserves more than just me. Right. He deserves more than just me for the work that he's done. I think you could look at that both ways. That's a very interesting point. To continue off of that, I noticed that right when he becomes Captain America, right, they're not like, oh, ship him off to the front lines. This dude is a superhuman. They're like, no, we're going to use you in propaganda for people
That was awkward.
Right, for people to purchase war bonds.
Like, I have it down, like, did we really need to do that?
Right.
Like, was that necessary for the movie?
Right, exactly. So that was an interesting dynamic that I saw this time and paid a little bit closer attention to, because even after he becomes the super soldier, they're like, well, we're not going to send you on the front lines. We're going to use you in the background to help. It's still that collecting scrapyard type thing.
But I also think that it was necessary to, like, bring on this Captain America look. Like, how they had to find a way for him to become this symbol for everybody. So they had to do something.
Right. No, for sure.
But it's awkward. It is very strange.
Well, no, for sure. Because Captain America, and especially like the shield, it serves as that, it symbolizes that protection of the United States, in this case in World War II, right? And to use him as this symbol for the war and the American people, yes, I feel that is very effective. But then at the same time, as you're looking at that more detailed perspective, like even when he gets this and now he has his chance, he's not going to miss out. He doesn't, he can make a difference because nobody's going to stop him now. Yeah.
Well, then you kind of feel bad for him because they're like, well, you're great, but let's just stick you in front of a crowd of people with a bunch of girls and
promote, try
to get money and really, like, reinforce the U.S. in the war by bringing everybody in and being like, look at this handsome, muscle man with these ladies dancing behind him.
Right, exactly. So you started to mention the relationship between Peggy and Steve, which is something that we see very early on when they first meet. It kind of, the flame kind of ignite there a little bit. And
then even in the car, like, and I feel like that makes you love him and her a little more, because you're like, she likes him. Like, when they're in the car and she's like, and he's still a little scrawny Steve, like, you're like, oh man, like, you're really rooting for it because you're like, oh, this poor little guy who, like, gets beat up in the alleyway, and now this, like, pretty girl likes him, and, like, just that establishment in the beginning, and then you, like, root for it. You're like, yes, like, I want them to be together.
Exactly. I love the progression of that relationship because it starts out at, boot camp. They're like a boot camp.
Like, naive and young, and you're like, is this gonna work?
Right. And I love how she looks past, she looks past him being scrawny. He's not the strongest. He doesn't excel at all the basic training courses and things like that. But she takes it like... Do you think
it's because she relates to him? Because she's a female?
That could very well be an element.
Because I feel like that's kind of, like, portrayed too. Like, she wants to do more, but nobody's allowing her to do more.
Well, now that you say that... Tommy Lee Jones' character, Colonel Phillips, he at times kind of dismisses her and talks down to her as far as her faith in Steve, even before he does it even after Steve becomes Captain America, with his desire to want to go and save Bucky and those troops that were captured, and she's behind him full force. She kind of questions it a little bit, but then she's like, she ultimately supports him, and Colonel Phillips is like, you need to get everything in check, she's like, I don't want to hear about it.
Yeah, and basically, like, blaming it on her emotions.
Right. So I thought that was an interesting take, at least igniting that flame between them. And then you see it grow, like you said, in the car when he talk about, like, a dancing part. He's looking for the right partner.
Right.
And
then she, like, brings that back.
Right.
To him, and they, like, still, like, that's, like, something. I thought the progression was good and how it relates to, it didn't take away from, like, the full storyline.
Yes.
Like, it never took away from, like, what was actually happening. It was just, like, there. Like, even when she, like, kisses him, and then he, like, looks at the Colonel, and he's like, well, I'm not gonna kiss you. It, like, really brought it back to, like, the movie, whereas, like, you had this romantic scene, and then you, like, turned around and you're like, well, I'm not gonna kiss you. And it brought you back to, like, okay, like, we're still in an action film.
Right. No, very good. I completely agree with that. I do like the addition as it progresses through the movie, where you, like you said, you go from the car, and then when they're in the plane and he's about to jump out to go behind the enemy lines, and Howard Stark and her start talking about, like, hey, once we're on our way back, you want to stop at such and such place to catch some fondue. And Steve's kind of jealous about that. He's like, he didn't understand what, like, fonduing was, He's like, oh, do you guys typically fondue? So you see that kind of blossom there, and him, like, trying to poke and prod, like, hey, you and Howard got something going on, or do I have room to kind of step in here, kind of thing. And then
she catches him.
Right. So that gets escalated. He questions her about it again, but then, she catches him kissing, and then she shows her jealous side, like,
Right.
Like, oh, okay, so now that you're a big super soldier, she mentions something as they're walking back, like something, oh, then now that you're a soldier and you can actually go into battle or whatever, you're
just like the rest of them.
Yes, she says, like, you're like everyone else, and then he obviously says, like, no, like, that's not what you think.
Right.
And I love this scene of her actually pulling out the pistol and shooting the shield because of
she was so angry.
Yeah, she just kind of fed up with it already and kind of testing his limits. But I love the scene where he is actually going with the troops back into enemy lines and they're taking down all the bases, and then she is in that like film room with Colonel Phillips, and they watch, and that scene pops up where he opens up that locket, that compass, and her picture's in there.
Oh yeah.
And that was kind of like that turning point, like it was confirmation for her, like he loves me, he really cares about me. So that was kind of like that, both sides are mutually interested and like involved, right?
You're like finally.
Exactly. So then it was once the kiss came at the final, the scene in the car there as they're racing after the plane, that was just that culmination of all this building up. I think they did a good job of that, putting little bits and pieces within the movie, that it wasn't just like, okay, at the end you can tell she likes him, he likes her, and then at the end they kiss. It was built up that there were instances throughout that you could connect with.
Their relationship development was very well.
I think so. Yeah, I completely agree. So, Ashely, is there anything else that really stood out to you as far as the film goes?
I tried to pay a lot of really to the music. Like, I feel like it brings you in. Nothing's overpowering. I think it would be a cool film, probably all of them, but this is the only one I've seen to watch in theaters, because there are like those highs and lows in the music. Like, you can tell it's supposed to get like super loud or like, not. Everything was just like really well done, and none of the music overpowered what was happening in the scenes. Right.
No, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm not going to speak a lot about the music, especially in this film. Not that it wasn't good. I think it complemented everything that was going on very well. But I will note that the end song, when he's in the plane and about to crash it, and they're talking about meeting up for a dance, right? The music that's going on there, that is a foreshadowing to something.
Pivotal later?
It does become pivotal later. I marked it down, so when we get to the certain movie/movies that this is involved with.
I just want to know if Peggy comes back.
Oh, I ain't telling you anything. I ain't telling you anything.
I need to know more now.
Like I said in our introductory episode, I will foreshadow some things and throw some little feelers out there, but I'm not gonna. Oh, no. I'm not ruining anything. You don't know if Peggy comes back or not. That's what we're watching these films for.
Google will tell me.
Don't you dare.
I will say I did a really good job of only reading the IMDb of the movie.
I'm surprised you even did that. So, I mean, even for you to do that, that's
perfectly fine with me. People's names.
Well, okay. That is one thing, is as we go through these films, a lot of names get thrown around, characters start coming back, and it's quite the journey. I'm not going to use the word mess, because it's not really a mess. It's very calculated and very pretty well woven together. So, yes, you will see names repeated. You will see characters come back, and it's quite the experience.
Do dead characters come back?
I said, I'm not telling you anything. I'm not telling you who dies. Get out of here.
I'm really trying.
I know you are, and I'm not giving way. You might catch me up.
I was sad to see Bucky die.
Yes. So that is something I actually want to get into a little bit later, but that is a pivotal point in the movie where you see Steve's kind of emotional side come out a little bit more.
And then he can't even get drunk about it.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. Yeah, he can't even wallow in his sorrow with drown himself in alcohol. His metabolism's too high, so it doesn't even have an effect on him. But no, seeing Cap kind of respond to that brotherly type relationship that he had with Bucky, especially just after saving him, right? Yeah. So he goes to great lengths to go save him, and now he loses him right away. So we can come back to that later, but yes, that was a very emotional scene as far as kind of putting yourself in Cap's shoes about the lengths that he's gone to keep this brotherhood alive,
right. I mean, it's literally like losing your sibling. You can see it, like, the emotion on his face, like, the moment it happens.
Right. Okay, the last thing I want to bring up before we go into our ratings and everything is just touch upon the final character we were introduced to at the end of the movie. That guy that had come out in the vehicle to stop Cap from escaping and kind of briefed him on what was going on. And then you also saw him in the end credit scene. That is Nick Fury. You will see what he develops into. I'm not going to reveal it just for purposes down the road. But in the next film, you will see him in a larger role and understand his backstory. So being introduced to him like this in the chronological order is very confusing, very similar to how it would be if we were to watch the release order with Iron Man at the beginning, where you're getting introduced to him, but you don't know what's going on. You're left with a lot of questions. So it's still confusing in this order, but just kind of put him in the back of your head for the next movie. We will dive more into him and understand his motive.
Got it.
So now that we've kind of hit the overall arching, key points on how you feel regarding individual characters, relationship with, Peggy, going through the storyline and plotline of the movie, what were some goods that really stuck out to you? Unless those are what you already mentioned.
Yeah, I think I mentioned a lot of what I truly enjoyed about it.
Okay.
I think my favorite battle scene was him driving in on the motorcycle. Just the effects of that was really cool.
Of course. But I'll go through what I felt was good about the movie, and then I'm going to come back to you, and we'll go over things that you might not have liked, because I have a couple. And again, these aren't things, as far as the bads, they aren't things that, ruin the movie, right?
Right.
So just as a disclaimer to all you listeners out there, I'm going to have bads about, if you've listened to the first episode, I'm a huge fan of the MCU as a whole, all these movies. I'm going to have things that might have been not as great in these movies, but every single movie we go through, I will recommend for you guys to watch. There's no reason to not go and actually give these movies a try. I love all these movies, but there are things throughout all these that might not be the greatest thing, and that make them better than others or worse than others. It's just things that happen. So some of the goods that I made sure I noted down, like we said before, making the viewer fall in love with Steve before he becomes Captain Rogers. We touched upon that. I loved, if you noticed, Ashley, where in that fight in the alleyway with the theater viewer, he grabs that trash can and holds it in front of him like a shield. So like that foreshadowing towards when he actually gets the Captain America shield, right? And then he does it again when that German agent kills Erskine, and then Steve's running after him, and the taxi flips over and everything. He grabs the door. Car door. Yes, and it's funny because the car door actually had a star on it that he's holding and blocking the bullet. So I love that little progression because it goes from the trash can, the door with the star on it, and then he grabs the vibranium shield, the pure silver shield. And then
this is the one I want.
Right, and then they design it, and it's actually what he uses for the rest of the time. So I love that little progression and that allusion to what he ends up becoming as far as using that shield as his protection. I really loved that flag scene when he was running with the troops. He hadn't become Captain America yet. He was in boot camp, and they were running, and they're all trying to climb that flagpole to get the flag, and he just walks over and takes the pin out and, and rides home with
It was that. Peggy. I might not be, as strong as everybody, but I'm more intelligent than the men you have here.
Right, and another thing that just speaks to his character rather than, it's not all about physicality, right? So going a step right past that was obviously the grenade scene where Colonel Phillips throws the grenade, and he's the only one that jumps on it, right? So I loved the scene of that in general, because that is another point that I didn't touch upon. When Peggy sees that, right, she's like, she sees it himself, what Dr. Erskine is also seeing in Steve, and I think starts to kind of fall in love with who he is at that point as well. But right in that same scene, I love Tommy Lee Jones, Colonel Phillips, when he looks at Erskine. Erskine kind of gives him that smirk, like I told you so, and he goes, he's still skinny.
Yeah, he knows in that moment that the right choice was made, but he's I don't want to admit it.
He doesn't want to admit it, right? Going from that, I love the interaction between Steve and Erskine. When they're in the tent and he's explaining to Steve, this is the procedure you're about to go through. And they go to cheers with the alcohol, and then he takes it back.
You have a procedure tomorrow.
Yeah, you have a procedure tomorrow. And he goes, oh, well, wait then. He's like, oh, I'm not waiting. I don't have a procedure tomorrow. I'll work. So I love those little quips that they add in there.
And I think that's what helped with their relationship development, even though it wasn't super long. He wasn't alive very long, but I feel that helped the development of the story. And back to that point where you made after he's shot and he's I don't think I'm good enough. I also feel that's the justice wasn't there. They were friends. He really did trust and believe in this guy, and then he loses that suddenly.
Right. And building upon that, I think the movie they did very well in the movie establishing relationships between Steven and all these other characters. Like, relationship between Peggy, who we've already talked about, between also Erskine. It's like, it's this guy that recruited him in, but they have these little quips that make it not just purely an action movie, right? Even though that it is, they throw these little things in there that relieve that tension and bring it down a notch from just like pure action, right? You see that little quips of comedy in there that kind of give you just a little bit of chuckle, that kind of lighten the mood, that it's not all serious and dark.
Yeah, I feel like that's a big reason why I never watched the movies. Like, I was like, I don't want to watch some stupid action movie. Like, and I've never seen any of them, and I've never really talked about them with anybody, so I had no idea what I was walking into. But like, that was a big put off for me. Like, I don't really watch a whole lot of action movies, but there was so much more to the movie than that. And
I'm glad you bring that up, because a lot of these movies go forward with that, as far as like the quippiness and throwing the comedy in there when it's necessary. And
there's like a relationships between all these people, but not only just friendships, like the romantic relationship, and then there's like funny little bits. Like, right.
And I'm glad you're seeing that too, that it's not just pure action and depicting these comic book characters with their villains. No, they do a very good job of forming these relationships, not only between the protagonist and the villain, but also the heroes themselves. Heroes interacting with each other, you'll come to see where, like, do they work well together? Do they not? What are things they need to amend or work on? Things like that. So you'll see all these dynamics that they go through. So I'm very excited for you to get to those points too. Very good. Oh, another little minor thing was that I really didn't notice when I watched it first was when they were doing the procedure on Steve, and it was getting, Howard Stark was saying, like, he was noting, like, 50%, 60% maximum
like
power.
80.
Right. So then everybody's like, he starts like screaming inside the pod, and they're like, shut it down.
Yeah, and like Peggy runs out.
Right. Steve was the only one out of everybody that was, no, I can keep going. I can do it. That he was the only one out of everybody trying to get him through this procedure, that he was the one that pushed through. He was the one that made the decision to keep going and then ultimately successful. Right. So right after that scene, I love the little interaction between Erskine and Steve as Erskine's dying, and Erskine's like over top of him, and Erskine doesn't say anything. He just points to his heart, saying it's you within. Even though you have this body, it's still you within. Just those little allusions kind of, they make the difference for me as I'm watching this.
I agree.
And then, like you said before, I love the funny lines, especially from Tommy Lee Jones's character, Phillips. Especially the one that cracked me up the most during this latest rewatch was, like you said, when he was kissing Peggy in the car as they were driving up to the plane, and Captain America looks at Tommy Lee Jones, and he's like, well, I ain't kissing you. Just stuff like that. Kind of, it takes you away from the seriousness of that current scene, but then it doesn't take away from entirety. It just kind of gives you a quick chuckle, lightens the mood for a minute, and then it goes back to the action. Right?
It doesn't, like, it helps with that just balance between, like, it being an action movie, it being, like, kind of like a romance going on. Like, it really just brings everything together, so it doesn't seem so one-sided.
Exactly. So those are my goods. Was there anything that stuck out to you that were things you didn't really care for the movie?
I just think a lot of some of the confusion, because, like you said, a lot of it builds throughout the films, so I was trying to just, like, be like, oh, you'll start to understand, but even at the end of the movie, I'm like, what is this cube? Why are we on an iceberg at the beginning? Like, just weird things that, like, I still don't have an answer to. Like, who's that man's house that they went to? I don't know.
Oh, the church.
Oh, okay.
I got you. Oh, no. Okay, yeah.
House, church, all the same.
To answer some of those things, I think the things that are a little bit more confusing, especially stuff that you mentioned at the beginning, are just little scenes that the places they are don't matter as much, but it's like they introduce the characters, and, like, you can tell that, like, their motivations aren't that great. With introducing Johann Schmidt, when he comes in and bursts down the church door and everything, and he kills everybody and tries to get the cube, right? So I think it's just establishing motives.
Like character.
Right. I know the setting could be confusing, but I think it's more for just establishing the character rather than where they might be, right? So because it doesn't become important later in the movie that where that was located.
Okay.
Right. So, but no, I understand that could be confusing. I was just
wondering, especially because, like, going into it that this is, like, such a massive series that you're like, okay, is this going to be important later? Like,
right. No, that's a very good point, especially when you're watching this for the first time and you're like, okay, what's important? What might not be that I need to carry on in my mind and, put there for later, like, recall.
Right.
So... No, excellent. Anything else?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So I got a couple things that I didn't really care for the movie that kind of stuck out to me. One being that opening sequence with them going to the Arctic and finding his shield and him encased in the ice. It's not that I didn't like that scene,
right.
but honestly, putting it right at the beginning like that, I felt that it took away from the impact of when he crashes the plane. There's not really a question of did he survive kind of thing, right? So it's like, that they found his shield. If they found his shield, he's probably alive. So then when he wakes up in modern day New York City, it's not as much of a shock, right? So if you putting that at the beginning of the movie and then understanding like, oh, they were in the Arctic and they found his shield because he crashed the plane there. That answers that question. But then it's like, I'm not worried that he didn't survive kind of thing, right? Like, it was just like, it didn't make the crash. I feel it didn't make the crash as impactful to me.
Right. Well, I guess, like, going into it, you kind of already know, though, that he's going to be alive.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I just feel like him crashing the plane wasn't as impactful.
Right. Yeah. I could see that. Even before watching the movie, I knew that he was not going to die at the end. Like, he's Captain America.
Well, yeah. But I mean, just because I feel that you're going through the movie, you're so encompassed, as we talked about, so encompassed in that relationship between him and Peggy that, like, as they're going down, or as he's going down, it's like, oh, don't worry, honey, he's gonna be alive.
You think he's gonna be fine, and then he wakes up in modern day. So you're like, where is she?
There's the twist.
She's obviously probably dead.
There's the twist. Yeah. Right. So
that was kind of disappointing.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. That's just kind of like the first thing that stuck out to me.
Yeah.
Another thing that really stuck out to me is, as you will come to see in further films, I'm not ruining any plot points by this, but Captain America as a whole, he's a good guy, right? That's what is encompassed him through this whole movie. And you will see in further films and everything that he is this good moral character that, he sets him apart from other heroes and especially the villains that he faces, right? But one thing that just kind of bothered me is the first scene when he saved those prisoners and they're going back out into behind enemy lines to take down all the bases that he
establishes his team.
Yeah, that part.
Okay.
Yeah, but he's using a pistol and everything and potentially killing these people, too, but because as the movies go on, he's not so much about the killing. He's about defending and taking out the enemy, but he's never straight like killing.
Right. As
maybe some of the other Avengers and other characters, not that their sole point is killing, but like they're
not afraid to go to that length.
Exactly. So I just felt that was a little off for me, that he comes out using this pistol and just shooting instead of using the shield as he does when they go and attack the base at the end. He just basically used the shield. Now, he uses rockets and stuff to blow up the tanks and stuff like that, but it wasn't like him using a weapon, right? So he's using the shield more as his weapon to disable and disorient these enemies. And
I don't know. Like killing.
Yeah, that just felt like a little off to me. It's not a good testament to his good-willed character, right? That's just me.
Right. I might didn't follow like the storyline as much.
I might be nitpicking there, but might. but it's just something that kind of I scratched my head to. That's all. I didn't with Bucky's death, with him dying like so soon after being saved. I feel we didn't feel the full weight of his death. Because we got scenes going forward. We saw how impactful it was for Steve, for sure. But I felt as a viewer, I didn't feel
it was just like overlooked.
I didn't feel. Yeah. I agree. Cause
there was nothing more to it. It was like, oh, he died, and I can't get drunk, and
it would be something.
Such a good like friendship. It was such a good like relationship that they had developed, and they had developed in the film for them just to be like, all right, he's dead. Let's move on.
Right. Something I just feel like typically in films like this that we see that like when a major character dies and it negatively impacts the main character, right? You see them use that as motivation to whatever they end up doing later in the film to defeat the bad guy or something like that, right? Where I didn't feel like that was any part of Steve's motivation to succeed in his mission in doing this.
Yeah, they didn't allude to that at all.
The only part that they did allude to it was like when they had Zola in the interrogation room and Colonel Phillips was like, well, you're now a loose end to Red Skull. So like, if we let you loose, like he's going to kill you. You're damaged goods now.
Right.
Or I can turn you over to Captain America and you just killed his best friend. Right. So like, have it as you will. That was the only part they alluded, like how upset Steve was to it besides the drinking scene. Right. So I just felt as a viewer, like I wasn't impacted by the death. Like I try to put myself in the protagonist's shoes as much as I can as I'm watching a film. So like, I just didn't feel like I felt so horribly that he died. It was because he was...
Yeah, there wasn't enough of a story there.
Right.
It was just like, oh,
I love the dynamic between the two, but I just didn't feel it. You know, I just didn't feel it compared to other things we will experience further down the road with relationships in the MCU. Another thing too was what I kind of look for in these villains, where it doesn't get generalized as like Red Skull was just looking for world domination. Right, kind of like the typical Nazi regime, aside from like the Aryan picking out like the superior race and all that.
Right.
I just felt like Red Skull's motivation was just to conquer and just be this dominating force. And I didn't feel like his motives were that personalized. So like I didn't
get a lot from him, to be honest.
Right. It was more general, like that general kind of conquest, domination motive. That wasn't,
no reason.
Yeah, it wasn't pertained, I feel, to him. It was more on that wide scale, like Nazism type dominance, right? Like,
yeah, it was like, okay, he was evil before, and then we injected him with a serum, and now he's even more evil, and there was no, like, why behind it.
Right. Another just tiny thing I want to nitpick at, but it made me laugh as the scene was going on, is when Steve was on the big ship that Red Skull was piloting, right, going towards the United States. It was the scene where the one crew member gets into the single-manned airplane, and Steve jumps on the plane with the other guy, and it drops down, and they're in the air, right?
Yes.
And Steve ejects the guy to fly back. Well, I just laughed because Steve and that other guy would have flown right off that plane if they would have went down with that, flying in the air.
Yeah,
he wasn't holding on to anything. They were just...
There was no truth to that.
It made me laugh. So that was just... I'm nitpicking there.
Also,
but
the guy falling off and, like, just being all blood. That was...
going into the propellers. Mm-hmm. That is something, like, I didn't make a note of it, but in my head I thought, wow, that's very, I don't want to say gory, but that's very dark for like a Marvel film. Because what you'll see is it gets more, it's Disney, right? So it's very
like you can go
encompassing,
to Disney
family
and
friendly.
Ride the ride.
It's very family friendly. So, that was just something that was like, oh, I didn't make a note of it, but I raised my eyebrows and was like, oh, I forgot about that scene. Oh my gosh.
Oh, well, that's a little bit much for me. Like, he could have just flown off and been fine, but okay.
Right. But no, those are the things that I just didn't typically care for. Like I said, does not make it a bad movie by any means, but just things I picked out that were like, I had some question marks, or like I just didn't feel like fit in perfectly with the movie. That's it. Some things I was nitpicking, but whatever. Final thing I personally would like to discuss before we end the episode is just I did go back and watch some of the behind the scenes footage from the film. So just little details of how they created this movie in general that I think they did absolutely amazing with. Was I ended up learning that in order to make Steve so small at the beginning, because his bulked up Captain America form is actually how Chris Evans looks. So to bring Chris Evans down to size and make him that small Steve Rogers, they did a very multitude of techniques where they actually took an additional actor, a double that was actually just slightly bigger than the size of how Steve Rogers is depicted when he's tiny, and just kind of did a face mapping thing where they took Chris Evans' face and put it on the other actor's face. They did stuff like that.
I was wondering.
Yeah.
I was wondering if it was like a completely different actor that played it, or...
Yes. So it wasn't completely CGI. They did do a little bit of visual effects to kind of bring down his body, make him, take away some of like the definition of his jawline and his neck and things like that. But for certain scenes, they didn't even have an actor in there, and they had just this blank plate to serve in his place. So then when they go in, they could put the visual effects in and place Chris Evans in the shot. So I thought that was very interesting, because as I was watching the first couple times, I'm like, this is very well done, and it doesn't look like poor CGI or anything. I was very curious. So I like that little allude in the behind the scenes footage there. I do want to give a shout out to Ryan Meinerding. He was the Captain America suit developer. I really liked how they did the progression of his suit. So the first thing you see is when he's on that US tour, that is actually an homage to how his suit looks in the original comics.
Yeah, so that suit reminds me of like when you go by like the kids' costumes.
Exactly.
Like that's exactly what it looks like to me.
Right, and it was funny watching the behind the scenes footage, because they were talking about like, well, if he goes out in this original suit, it's not going to be combat effective, right? He has these like big red pirate boots and these wings that flare out from his cowl and stuff like that. And it's like, so I loved how they paid homage to that, but then developed his suit more combat effective and more fit for the battleground type scenes, right?
Yeah.
So in addition to that, I did learn that as they were filming, they used multitude of different types of shields for his action scene. So like he had like a big metal shield when it was like you needed the visual look of the shininess or something,
Right.
the metallic look, right? And then they had a rubber shield for when he was actually like beating on people with the shield, obviously to protect other cast members and stuff like that. But then they would have like a magnetic shield when he placed it on his back, and they had to make it form to Chris Evans's physical shape and things like that. So it was a very interesting dynamic to kind of look at. And then they also used the CGI, obviously, when he's like throwing the shield and stuff like that. So I really liked the direction that they went on how the dynamic of the shield is, where he can throw it, catch it, he forms to the shield. The shield is now a part of him.
Right, like it's a huge symbol, and then even like in the beginning you're like, oh my god, here's this guy running around with his shield on his back, like, and that's before it, like, you get the whole symbolism of like it being a circle, and then it just like plays on through all of it, like. And they allude to that in the beginning when they're finding the shield. Right.
And not only that it is a symbol of protection for the United States in this, in World War II, but then also it is his symbol. It is, when you see that, Captain America. Right. So no, that's all the things I just kind of want to note from what I found behind the scenes that I didn't previously know and I found interesting. But lastly, before we end the episode, I'd like to actually go into, this is where I want to go into like a ranking portion of the episode. And I want to do this every episode. So right now, before we get into like too many, right, we won't rank them against each other. I was kind of thinking we could do a little bit of an allude to that once we watch the Avengers and end phase 1. Then we can kind of compare movies down a list.
Right.
But just right now, we can kind of give like a score. So if there was anything, as far as ranking goes, Captain America, the First Avenger on Rotten Tomatoes, it was rated 79% from the critics and 75% due to the fan vote. I personally give it an 86 on my list. So I rank it as, now, like I said, I've seen all these films, so it's like I know where it's in my list, right? So I ranked it as my 15th best movie. Now, this is just my opinion. And this list is very fluid. So as I go through these movies again, it can very well change. But as right now, I just have it as an 86 out of 100. Was it a perfect film? No, but I thought it did a very good job of, one, an origin story for Captain America. We saw many dynamics, one within himself, but then also in the relationship, like we mentioned, to other characters like Peggy Carter and, Colonel Phillips and things like that, and the dynamic that he progressed through as we went through the film. I think it did a very good job. I love origin stories because I feel like it helps set me up for grander films where we bring characters together. So it's like, I already know this backstory. I already know what this character's been through. So I think it did a very good job and was very encompassing of his character. So, what would you think? On a scale of 1 to 100 off the top of your head, what would you give it?
I mean, I'd probably give it a 75, because the character development and the relationship development was there. I would have just liked to have seen more of, like, a why behind, like, the villain is the way he is. And just, like, small things that I think I needed a little bit more of.
Right.
But I do think, like, overall, like, the character development, the relationship development, the action scenes, everything was very realistic. Nothing was, like, kind of undone. But, like, and not having seen any of the other films, so I don't know, like, I don't really have anything to compare it to.
Right. We hope you enjoyed listening to our in-depth discussion of Captain America, the First Avenger. Like always, we would love to hear from you. Do you agree with our takes? Do you disagree? Is there anything we missed in our analysis? Please reach out to us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by searching Mission MCU Podcast, or you can email us at missionmcu@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date on our latest episodes. Be sure to tune in next week when I am joined by my good friend Matt, and we talk about the newly released Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. If you are following along with Ashely and I's First Watch/Rewatch series, or you haven't watched the new Ant-Man movie yet, I would advise you to watch it prior to listening to next week's episode because there will be major spoilers. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time on Mission MCU.